Welcome to another episode of PLA with myself, Nick, and Bruno. We've got 3 questions today. We'll do the first 2 in one, and then we'll continue with the last one with Nick. The first 2 in one questions, Bruno, the first one is to do penalties, second one, outgoing inspections. The first one states that, and it comes from an agent, a property is on the sale, is on the sales market, sorry. The potential buyer decides he wants to rent the property for 6 months, right? And if he buys the property within 3 months, is the buyer or tenant still liable for early cancellation, paying the owner / seller for commission paid? So I think the concern there, of course, is with the 3 months commission for the agent. And then let me just slide straight into the outgoing inspection one so you can combine the answers. So with outgoing inspection, it just goes as a property sold and then the tenant's lease expires on the eve of date of transfer. Do we still need to complete that outgoing inspection?
So it's a very technical question. I suppose for starters, the prospects of meeting this repetitively in practice is very small. But if we did try to break it down to smaller components, so if the concern here, what I understand from paying the owner seller for commission paid, it implies that one of the concerns over here is the owner seller is already paid for commission, the commission that was due for, I'm assuming, tenant acquisition, meaning that now that the property is being transferred, did he have to pay for tenant acquisition up to the value of 6 months when the rental value in truth was only 3 months, right? So that's how I understand it. The seller owner has paid something, and now this guy is basically, for all intents and purposes, cancelling the lease early and stepping into different shoes. So I think from a viewer perspective, it's important to remember in the legal world, sometimes you want to start approaching the problem by wearing different hats. So if you do treat the lessee and the buyer as 2 separate people, the problem will play out in one way, and then obviously if you treat them as the same person, will play out in another way. So the property is already on the sale market. The buyer comes in and says, listen, he wants to rent it for 6 months. Now, the reason for this is obviously quite important. Why does he want to rent it for 3 months? If the property is on the sale market, I'm assuming that it was introduced to the buyer through the sales agent. So for starters, it's already in the agent's best interest that this buyer actually buy the property, whether it be in 3 months or 6 months. So if I was the agent that dealt with the sale, I wouldn't be overly concerned regarding the leasing com and procurement com, bearing in mind that your sales com could be far, far higher if this guy stays. So within the 6 months, even if it's 3 days, if this guy buys the property, you're making decent comp. So the potential buyer decides that he wants to rent. So the sales agent is now saying, look, you're going to rent the property. So for all intents and purposes, I acquired a lessee. If you'll end up buying the property, I acquired a buyer. So either way, the agent is going to make money one way or another. Did he acquire a lessee for 6 months? Well, it really depends now. If the seller has paid com to the value of 6 months for procurement, so basically a calculation of the rental over 6 months and a percentage of that for the procurement of the tenant, then the seller has opted and enjoyed the fact that he's got a tenant for 6 months. Now, if the buyer buys the property earlier than the 6 month period, now, the next point that we need to look at is, number one, technically speaking, for all intents and purposes, this buying the property doesn't necessarily terminate the lease, right? So that's that one doesn't necessarily go with the other. One needs to remember also that there's a transfer period within which you need to transfer the property. So this buyer would still be on the property for an extended period of time, probably around the 6 months mark anyway. So again, it goes to the technical nature of the question. If the owner has paid com to the value of 6 months, and he feels that this has nothing to do with the sales com that's going to be paid later, and this person buys the property and happens to take transfer by the conclusion of 3 months, then yes, in theory, the owner could very well go to the buyer and say, look, I paid to have you here for 6 months, for them to find you and to put you here for 6 months. You've only stayed for 3, so I overpaid on the com. I feel that you owe me money because I was anticipating receiving rent for a full 6 months and you didn't give that to me. So I shouldn't be paying a fee in order to procure that rent. So in theory, yes, you could. But I think there's a lot of elements to this that would probably make it maybe a ludicrous suggestion. Insofar as outgoing inspections is concerned, with respect to this, if this buyer buys the property, is the landlord responsible for doing an outgoing inspection? So yes, in theory, because of the Rental Housing Act, because the lease is terminated, there has to be an outgoing inspection because it's the end of the lease. And again, this buyer is going in wearing a different hat, right? It's overly technical. It's an overly technical question because after this, when the property is sold, the owner of the property isn't going to charge this lessee damages to return the property to the condition that it was in. In reality, practically speaking, the condition that the property is in is how the tenant's buying it. If the tenant has an issue with how he took care of the property and how the property should be, in what condition the property should be now that he's bought it, that should have probably already been dealt with in the sales agreement. So this exit inspection is going to play a very, very, very minor role. So again, I wouldn't overly stress it. Do an inspection anyway, because at the end of the day, you'd want to inspect the property on both sides. But I think it is, again, it is very technical on whether it's actually going to serve any purpose.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for that, for the answer, Bruno. And then we're going to